Vincent Orlov stormed into the grand ballroom, his sharp gaze scanning the lavishly decorated space. His tailored black suit was impeccable, his presence commanding. But the second he spotted the bride at the altar, his expression twisted in confusion. This wasn't the right wedding. A murmur spread through the guests as they turned to look at him. The officiant paused mid-sentence, and the groom, an unimpressive man in a beige tux, glared at him. The bride, a delicate blonde, gasped, her eyes widening in horror. "Who are you?" she demanded. Vincent cleared his throat, adjusting the cuff of his expensive watch. "I think I made a mistake." A hushed silence fell over the room. Then, from the side of the altar, a woman stepped forward, her dark eyes filled with suspicion. She wasn't the bride, but she had the same delicate features, only sharper, more intense. Her deep burgundy dress hugged her figure, and her black hair cascaded in waves past her shoulders. Unlike the bride, she wasn't scared. She was furious. "Who crashes a wedding by mistake?" she asked, arms crossed, Vincent's lips pressed into a thin line. "I was invited to a wedding at this venue. Clearly, I got the wrong one." The woman arched a brow. "You don't look like someone who makes mistakes." He didn't. Vincent Orlov was a man who controlled everything: his businesses, his investments, his life. But somehow he had walked into the wrong wedding, and now a room full of strangers was staring at him like he had just shattered a sacred moment. The groom squared his shoulders. "You need to leave," Vincent nodded. "Right, my apologies." He turned to go, but the woman in burgundy wasn't done with him. "Wait." She stepped closer, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "Who are you?" He hesitated. Something about her made him pause. Maybe it was the fire in her eyes or the way she didn't seem the least bit intimidated by him. "Vincent Orlov." Recognition flickered across her face. "The Vincent Orlov, as in the millionaire real estate mogul." He gave a short nod. He wasn't surprised she knew his name. Most people in business circles did. The bride's sister exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Unbelievable." Vincent tilted his head. "And you are—" she hesitated, then sighed. "Dahlia Grant, maid of honor. And the only person in this room who seems to find this whole thing suspicious." He almost smiled, almost, "because I made a mistake. Because men like you don't just make mistakes." Her gaze flickered over to the bride. "And because my sister's fiancé comes from old money. The kind of money that doesn't mix with yours." Vincent narrowed his eyes. "You think I'm here for some kind of sabotage?" She shrugged. "I wouldn't put it past you." He should have walked away. He had no reason to stay, but something about Dahlia intrigued him. She wasn't like the women he usually encountered, those who either fawned over his wealth or feared his power. She was sharp, skeptical, and completely unimpressed by him. A slow smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "If I were here to sabotage a wedding, I'd have done a much better job." For the first time, her lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. The officiant cleared his throat. "Mr. Orlov, if you don't mind." Vincent exhaled, turning toward the exit. But as he did, he caught Dahlia watching him, her expression unreadable. Something told him this wouldn't be the last time they met. Vincent hadn't expected to think about Dahlia Grant again after leaving that wedding, but somehow she stayed lodged in his mind like an unresolved puzzle. There was something about her sharp, challenging, and completely unimpressed by him. He told himself it didn't matter. He had more important things to focus on. His latest real estate deal was nearing its final stages, a multi-million-dollar acquisition of prime waterfront property that would cement his dominance in the market. But even as he sat in his office, overlooking the glittering skyline, his thoughts drifted back to the woman in the burgundy dress. It wasn't just that she had challenged him. It was the way she had looked at him, like she was trying to figure out his next move before he even made it. So when he found himself attending a charity gala 2 weeks later and spotted her across the room, he wasn't entirely surprised. Dahlia stood near the bar, her posture relaxed but alert, her dark hair swept over one shoulder. She wasn't draped in diamonds like the other women in the room, nor did she seem particularly interested in the lavish surroundings. But there was something undeniably striking about her, something that made her stand out despite her lack of effort. Vincent wasn't the type to hesitate. He crossed the room with the same confidence that had made him a force in the business world, stopping just beside her. "You look less suspicious tonight," he said. Dahlia turned, her expression unreadable. "And you still look like a man who doesn't make mistakes." He let out a quiet breath, more amused than he should have been. "Yet you're still convinced I crashed that wedding with an agenda." She picked up her drink, swirling the amber liquid. "I haven't entirely ruled it out." He liked this verbal sparring, the way she didn't back down. "And what would my motive be?" Dahlia studied him for a moment before taking a sip of her drink. "Maybe you have a grudge against the groom. Maybe you wanted to make a scene. Maybe you just enjoy disrupting things you don't belong in." Vincent leaned against the bar, watching her closely. "Interesting theories, but what if I told you the truth was far less dramatic?" She tilted her head slightly. "I'd say I don't believe you," he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You don't trust easily, do you?" Dahlia set her glass down. "Not when it comes to men like you." He hadn't expected honesty, but he appreciated it. "Men like me, powerful, calculated, used to getting exactly what they want." Vincent considered that. She wasn't wrong. He had built his empire by being relentless, by never backing down. But he had never once been accused of being reckless. That was why her suspicion intrigued him. It was a rare thing for someone to question his motives so openly. Before he could respond, a voice interrupted them. "There you are, Dahlia." A man approached, tall with an easy smile, dressed in a navy suit that was just slightly too polished. Vincent didn't need to ask who he was. The way he placed a hand on Dahlia's waist told him everything. Dahlia's posture stiffened for the first time that evening. "This is James," she said after a moment, "my fiancé." Vincent felt something unexpected, a flicker of irritation, sharp and unwelcome. He didn't let it show. Instead, he gave a polite nod. "Nice to meet you." James extended a hand, his grip firm but not aggressive. "Same here." "I've heard your name before. Real estate, right?" Vincent accepted the handshake but kept his attention on Dahlia. "That's right." James turned to Dahlia, brushing a kiss against her temple. "I was just talking to the mayor's team. They're interested in working with our firm for next year's event." Dahlia gave a small nod, her expression neutral. Vincent took that as his cue. He had crashed a wedding by mistake. He wasn't about to crash an engagement on purpose. "Enjoy your evening," he said smoothly before stepping away. As he walked through the ballroom, something about that interaction gnawed at him. Dahlia had acted composed, but there had been something else beneath the surface, something restrained. And for the first time in a long time, Vincent Orlov found himself walking away from a situation he wasn't sure he wanted to leave behind. Vincent told himself he wouldn't think about Dahlia again. And yet, days later, he found himself in his office, his focus slipping as he recalled the way her gaze had darkened when James appeared at the gala. She had introduced him as her fiancé, but there had been no warmth in her voice, no trace of affection in her stance. It had been a statement of fact, nothing more. That should have been the end of it. Dahlia Grant was engaged, and Vincent Orlov didn't waste time on impossibilities. But when an invitation landed on his desk, a fundraiser for an arts program, hosted by none other than the Grant family, something deep inside him stirred. Attending was a bad idea. He knew it even as he adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit that evening and stepped into his car. But Vincent had built his entire empire by following his instincts, and right now, his instincts told him that this wasn't over. The event was held in a grand hall, all polished marble and glittering chandeliers, the kind of place that screamed old money. Vincent moved through the crowd with the ease of a man who belonged anywhere he chose to be. He exchanged pleasantries with politicians, business moguls, and socialites, but his gaze kept drifting across the room until finally he saw her. Dahlia stood near one of the large windows, her posture poised yet distant, as though she were physically present but mentally somewhere else. Tonight, she wore an emerald green gown that hugged her frame, the color making her eyes appear even darker. She sipped from a flute of champagne, nodding absent-mindedly as an older woman spoke to her. Vincent didn't hesitate. He crossed the space between them, his presence drawing Dahlia's eyes to him before he even spoke. The woman beside her gave him a polite smile before excusing herself, leaving them alone. "You just happen to show up at all the events I attend?" Dahlia asked, tilting her head slightly. "Seems that way." She studied him, her fingers tightening slightly around her glass. "I assume you didn't come here just for the art." Vincent's lips twitched. "I appreciate a well-curated collection." Dahlia exhaled, shaking her head as if she saw right through him. "You don't strike me as the type who enjoys wasting time." "I don't. So why are you here?" Vincent held her gaze. "I could ask you the same thing," her brow furrowed just slightly. "It's my family's event." "That's not what I meant." Something flickered in her expression, something guarded, but before she could respond, a familiar voice interrupted them. "There you are." James approached, his polished demeanor firmly in place. He slipped an arm around Dahlia's waist, but Vincent didn't miss the way her shoulders tensed at the contact. "Vincent," James continued, his tone polite but tinged with something territorial, "didn't expect to see you here." Vincent met his gaze without hesitation. "I like to support the arts," James chuckled, though it lacked any real humor. "Didn't take you for the sentimental type." Vincent ignored the bait, turning his attention back to Dahlia. "Enjoy your evening." And then he walked away. He wasn't sure why he left so abruptly. Maybe it was because he had seen what he needed to see. The way Dahlia's expression had shifted the second James appeared, the way her body had reacted to his presence with something that looked a lot like reluctance. Vincent didn't chase things. He built, acquired, and conquered, but he had never been the kind of man to pursue something that wasn't meant to be his. Yet, as he stepped outside into the cool night air, he couldn't shake the feeling that Dahlia Grant was standing at a precipice. And for the first time in a long time, Vincent Orlov wondered if he was meant to be the one to catch her before she fell. Vincent hadn't planned on seeing Dahlia again so soon. But fate, it seemed, had other ideas. A week after the fundraiser, he found himself stepping out of his car in front of a quiet, upscale cafe tucked away from the city's usual chaos. He wasn't here for business, nor was he here for pleasure, at least, not intentionally. Yet the moment he walked inside, his gaze landed on her. Dahlia sat by the window, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her coffee cup, her expression distant. She wasn't dressed for an event this time, no elegant gowns, no carefully curated perfection. Instead, she wore a fitted sweater and dark jeans, her hair loosely pulled back, a few strands escaping to brush against her cheek. She looked real. And for the first time, Vincent saw her without the weight of expectations pressing down on her shoulders. He could have walked away. He should have. Instead, he crossed the cafe, stopping just beside her table. Dahlia looked up, surprise flickering across her face before something softer replaced it. "You again," she murmured. Vincent pulled out the chair across from her, waiting for her to object. When she didn't, he sat. "I wasn't expecting company," she admitted, studying him. "Neither was I." A small breath of laughter escaped her, and for the first time it wasn't laced with skepticism or challenge, it was just hers. For a moment, neither spoke. The cafe around them hummed with quiet conversation, the scent of roasted coffee beans filling the air. It was a stark contrast to the world they usually occupied: the grand ballrooms, the strategic events, the polished facades. Here there were no prying eyes, no expectations, just them. Dahlia stirred her coffee absent-mindedly. "You always turn up when I least expect it." Vincent leaned back slightly. "Should I apologize for that?" She shook her head, her gaze dropping briefly before meeting his again. No, there was something unspoken between them, something neither was ready to name, but Vincent wasn't a man who ignored the obvious. "You don't love him," he said quietly. Dahlia didn't flinch, didn't feign ignorance. Instead, she exhaled, her fingers tightening around her cup. "I thought I could," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought if I did everything right, if I met the expectations, eventually it would feel real." Vincent studied her, the weight of her words settling between them. "And now," her lips parted, but before she could answer, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, then sighed. James. Vincent didn't need to see the name to know. He could read it in her face, in the way her shoulders tensed, in the way a shadow passed over her features. She silenced the call and looked back at him. I don't know how to walk away from something I've spent years convincing myself I wanted, she admitted. Vincent reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. It was a simple touch, but it sent something electric through the air between them. You don't have to know, he said. You just have to decide. Dahlia's breath hitched slightly, her eyes searching his, and in that moment something shifted. It wasn't about wealth or power, expectations or obligations. It was about what they both already knew but had been too afraid to say. Dahlia Grant was standing at the edge of a choice, and Vincent Orlov was done pretending he wasn't the one she wanted to fall into. Dahlia didn't answer Vincent right away. Instead, she stared at their hands where his fingers barely brushed hers. The cafe around them faded into a distant hum, the weight of the moment settling between them like an unspoken truth. Then, slowly, she withdrew her hand. Not in rejection, but in hesitation. I don't make impulsive decisions, she said, her voice quiet but steady, not about things that matter. Vincent studied her, the flicker of conflict in her eyes more telling than she likely realized. She wasn't brushing him off. She wasn't denying what was between them. She was afraid of what it would mean to admit it. You don't strike me as someone who ignores what's right in front of you either, he said. Dahlia exhaled, looking past him toward the window, where the city stretched beyond the glass. Leaving James isn't just about walking away from a relationship. It's walking away from expectations, from a life I've spent years building. Vincent didn't argue. He knew better than to push when someone was standing on the edge of a decision that would change everything. So instead, he leaned back slightly, giving her space. Then tell me this, what do you want? Dahlia's gaze flicked back to him, something raw in the way she looked at him, like she wanted to say something but wasn't sure she had the right to. Before she could answer, the bell above the cafe door jingled. A familiar voice cut through the quiet. Dahlia, James. Dahlia stiffened. Vincent saw it the way her body instinctively tensed, the way her fingers curled around her coffee cup as if bracing for impact. James strode toward them, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes sharp as he took in Vincent's presence. He stopped at the edge of the table, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed but controlled. I tried calling, James said, his tone even. You didn't answer. Dahlia set her cup down and met his gaze. I needed time to think. James's jaw tightened, though he kept his composure. Think about what? Silence stretched between them. Vincent didn't move, didn't speak. This wasn't his conversation to lead. Dahlia inhaled deeply. About us, about what I want. James glanced at Vincent, then back at her. A flicker of something passed through his expression, understanding, maybe, or realization. You've already made up your mind, haven't you? Dahlia didn't look away. I think I have. James exhaled sharply, his lips pressing together. For the first time since he arrived, he let the mask slip, not anger, not resentment, just quiet acceptance. I suppose I always knew, he admitted. But I thought maybe if we kept moving forward, it would be enough. Dahlia's throat worked as she swallowed. I thought the same. James nodded slowly, then looked at Vincent again. This time there was no hostility, just acknowledgement. Take care of her, James said, his voice low but firm. Vincent met his gaze without hesitation. I intend to. James lingered for a moment longer before stepping back. He turned without another word and walked away, leaving Dahlia staring after him, her expression unreadable. The silence between her and Vincent stretched, heavier now but with something different, something final. Dahlia let out a slow breath, then looked back at Vincent. I don't know what happens next. Vincent reached for her hand again, this time taking it fully in his. Then let's figure it out together. For the first time in a long time, Dahlia didn't feel like she was standing at a precipice alone. Dahlia had never felt so weightless and yet so firmly grounded all at once. As Vincent's fingers curled around hers, the noise of the cafe, the lingering shadow of her past, and the uncertainty of the future all faded to nothing. For the first time in years, she wasn't making a choice based on obligation, expectation, or fear. She was choosing something because it felt right, because he felt right. Outside, the city stretched before them, the streets humming with life as they stepped into the cool night air. Vincent's presence beside her was steady, his warmth grounding. He didn't rush her, didn't press for words she wasn't ready to say. He simply was, and that was enough. Dahlia exhaled slowly, her breath curling in the evening air. I feel like I just rewrote my entire life in a single conversation. Vincent's gaze lingered on her, unreadable yet intent. Maybe it was never written the way you wanted it to be. She turned to him, searching his face. And what about you? You don't seem like the kind of man who rewrites his story for anyone. A flicker of something passed through his expression, something unguarded. I don't. But maybe I was waiting for the right reason. Her heart stuttered. Vincent Orlov was a man who built his world with precision and control, a man who didn't chase what wasn't his to have. And yet here he was, standing beside her, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The realization settled deep in her chest, warm and terrifying all at once. They began walking, their steps slow, unhurried. Dahlia let the silence stretch between them, the weight of the night pressing in, making everything feel sharper, more real. "What happens now?" she asked eventually, her voice quieter than she intended. Vincent's grip on her hand tightened just slightly. "That depends on what you want." Dahlia hesitated. She had spent so long being told what her life should be, what decisions were expected of her. Now, for the first time, she had a choice that was entirely her own. She turned to him, her dark eyes unwavering. "I want to know what this could be without expectations, without pressure." Vincent nodded, his gaze steady. "Then that's what we'll do." And somehow that simple response made everything feel easier. Weeks passed, and with them came a shift Dahlia hadn't known she needed. She had spent so long living by rules that weren't her own, shaping herself into a version that fit neatly within the world she had grown up in. But now she was relearning what it meant to choose her own path. Vincent didn't push. He didn't demand answers she wasn't ready to give. He simply made space for her, something no one had ever done before. He took her to places she had never thought to go, quiet, hidden corners of the city, rooftop gardens where the world felt distant, private galleries where time seemed to pause. He showed her a world beyond obligation, beyond expectation. And in return, she found herself giving him pieces of herself she had never shared with anyone. One evening, as they stood on the balcony of his penthouse, the skyline stretching endlessly before them, Vincent turned to her, something unreadable in his expression. "I don't do things halfway, Dahlia," he said, his voice low, firm. "When I want something, I take it, and I want you." Her breath caught, not because he was claiming her, but because he was choosing her, and she was finally ready to do the same. It wasn't long before the shift became undeniable. Dahlia had never been one for grand displays, but the moment she walked into the gala that evening on Vincent's arm, the world took notice. Whispers followed them, curiosity buzzing like electricity. The Grant family's dutiful daughter had broken free from expectation, stepping into something entirely new. James was there, of course. Their paths would always cross in these circles, but when he met her gaze across the ballroom, there was no resentment, no lingering tension. Just quiet understanding. And when Vincent pulled her onto the dance floor, his hand resting firmly against her waist, Dahlia didn't think about the past or the future. She thought only of this, of him. The proposal wasn't elaborate, it wasn't staged or planned, it wasn't a spectacle. It was them. They had spent the evening in one of the quiet places. Vincent had introduced her to a private villa overlooking the water, far from the demands of the city. The night was warm, the stars endless above them, and as they sat on the terrace, a bottle of wine between them, Vincent reached into his pocket and pulled out a box. Dahlia froze, her breath catching as he opened it to reveal a ring, simple, elegant, stunning, no speech, no preamble. Just a quiet certainty in his gaze as he said, "Marry me." Dahlia pressed a hand to her mouth, her heart pounding. "Vincent, I don't need fanfare, I don't need theatrics, I just need you." His voice was steady, unwavering. "Say yes." The answer had never been more obvious. She reached for the ring, her fingers brushing his as she whispered, "Yes." And the moment he slid it onto her finger, she knew she wasn't just choosing him, she was choosing herself. The wedding was nothing like the one she had almost walked into before. There were no grand expectations, no suffocating traditions, just them. A ceremony beneath a canopy of lights, surrounded by only those who truly mattered. a dress that she had chosen without anyone else's input, vows that weren't scripted but spoken with quiet intensity. And when Vincent kissed her, sealing their future, Dahlia knew she had finally rewritten her story. One that was entirely, completely hers, and she had never been happier.